If you were forced to choose between your own safety and saving a helpless animal during a deadly hurricane, what would you do? Prepare yourself for an incredibly moving story of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals that will touch your heart in ways you never expected. In the coastal town of Port Arthur, Texas, September 2023 brought one of the most devastating hurricanes the region had seen in decades. Hurricane Marcus, a Category 4 storm with sustained winds of 145 mph, was bearing down on the Gulf Coast with terrifying speed, leaving residents scrambling for safety with precious little time. Among those preparing for evacuation was Michael Dawson, a 34-year-old former Coast Guard rescue swimmer who had settled into civilian life as a high school teacher. Despite his training for dangerous situations, nothing could have prepared him for the choice he would soon face as the hurricane's outer bands began to lash the community. Just 3 doors down from Michael lived the Henderson family, who had hastily packed their belongings and fled inland the previous day, leaving in such a panic that a terrible oversight would soon become apparent. In their rush to escape, something precious had been left behind, something that would haunt them for days to come. As Michael loaded the last of his emergency supplies into his truck, the howling wind carried a sound that stopped him in his tracks, a distant, desperate barking that seemed to be coming from the Henderson property. Something about the panic in those barks triggered Michael's instincts, honed by years of rescue work. The Henderson family's newest addition was Max, a 4-month-old yellow Labrador puppy, who had brought boundless joy to their 2 young children since his adoption just 6 weeks earlier. In the chaos of evacuation, a terrible miscommunication occurred when each parent thought the other had secured the puppy in the car. Michael knew every minute counted as the hurricane approached, with mandatory evacuation orders in effect and first responders already pulling out of the area. The rational decision was clear: get to safety immediately. Yet that desperate barking continued to cut through the howling wind, growing more frantic by the minute. The scene that greeted Michael as he fought his way through the rain to the Hendersons' backyard would be seared into his memory forever. There was Max, soaking wet and shivering violently, tied to a large oak tree with barely enough slack in his leash to move a few feet in any direction. The puppy's golden fur was plastered to his tiny body, his eyes wide with terror as debris from the strengthening storm flew dangerously close. Each time thunder cracked overhead, Max would pull desperately against his restraint, choking himself in his panic to escape the approaching disaster that his animal instincts clearly sensed. By this point, the outer bands of Hurricane Marcus were already causing significant damage, with street signs bending and smaller branches snapping off trees. The National Weather Service had issued dire warnings that anyone remaining in the evacuation zone was facing imminent danger of death. Yet here was this helpless creature, unable to save himself. Michael's phone buzzed with an emergency alert. Seek shelter immediately. Extreme life-threatening conditions expected within 30 minutes. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to leave, knowing that his window for escape was rapidly closing as floodwaters began rising on the main evacuation routes. Rain pelted Michael's face as he stood frozen in indecision, calculating the risk against his conscience. The puppy's eyes seemed to lock with his, a connection that transcended species, a pure, desperate plea for help that Michael found impossible to ignore despite the danger rushing toward them both. Michael had lost his own beloved dog just 8 months earlier, a loyal companion of 12 years who had seen him through his military service and the difficult transition back to civilian life. Perhaps it was this still raw grief that made the sight of the abandoned puppy so unbearable to him in this moment of crisis. The sky darkened ominously as the hurricane's full force approached, transforming day into an eerie twilight. Power lines had already begun to fall in neighboring streets, and the distinctive crack of splitting wood could be heard as trees began to surrender to the relentless force of the wind. As Max continued his desperate struggle against his restraint, Michael made a decision that would put everything on the line. His safety, his future, potentially his life. "Hang on, buddy," he whispered, though his words were immediately swept away by the wind. "I'm not leaving you here to die." Michael's hands trembled as he fumbled with the soaking wet knot of Max's leash, the wind now so powerful that he had to brace himself against the tree to avoid being knocked over. The puppy's frantic movements only made the task more difficult. The tight knot seeming to tighten further, with each desperate pull against the restraint. "Easy, boy, easy," Michael shouted above the roar of the storm, though his words were swallowed by a deafening crack as a large branch from a neighboring tree came crashing down mere feet away. Max yelped in terror, his small body shaking so violently that Michael feared the puppy might be going into shock from the combination of fear and the rapidly dropping temperature. The sky had turned an ominous greenish black, a telltale sign that the worst of Hurricane Marcus was nearly upon them. Michael's Coast Guard training flashed through his mind. He knew all too well the statistics of those who delayed evacuation, the grim reality of recovery operations that followed such choices. Yet here he was, defying all rational thought for a puppy he barely knew. Michael's phone had been buzzing incessantly with emergency alerts and messages from concerned friends who knew he lived in the evacuation zone. His sister in Houston had called 6 times in the past hour, her increasing panic evident in the voicemails she left pleading with him to confirm he had evacuated safely as promised. As water began to pool around his ankles, Michael realized with growing dread that flash flooding had already begun. The drainage systems were overwhelmed, and soon the streets would become impassable rivers, cutting off his final chances of escape, even if he managed to free the terrified puppy from his restraint. "Come on," Michael muttered through gritted teeth as he worked at the knot, his fingers growing numb from the cold rain. A sudden gust nearly knocked him off his feet, sending a plastic lawn chair flying past them like a missile. Max cowered against the tree, his eyes wide with a primal fear that broke Michael's heart. Michael's mind flashed to the Henderson children, 8-year-old Emma and 5-year-old Jake, who had proudly shown him their new puppy just weeks earlier, their faces beaming with the pure joy that only a child's first dog can bring. The thought of having to tell those children that their beloved Max had perished in the storm was simply unbearable. The knot finally began to loosen under Michael's persistent efforts, but just as hope flickered, a terrifying sight caught his peripheral vision. The massive oak tree in the center of the Hendersons' yard was beginning to lean, its roots slowly lifting from the saturated ground as the hurricane-force winds pushed against its sprawling canopy with relentless force. If that tree fell, it would crush everything in its path, including the smaller tree where Max was tethered. Time was no longer measured in minutes but in seconds, each one potentially their last, as nature's fury intensified around them with merciless power and indifference to their plight. With a final desperate tug, the knot came free in Michael's hands, but to his horror, Max didn't move. The puppy had exhausted himself in his earlier struggles and now lay shivering against the tree trunk, too frightened and depleted to comprehend that freedom was finally possible. Michael didn't hesitate. Scooping the soaking wet puppy into his arms, he cradled Max against his chest and turned to make a run for his truck, only to find the path now blocked by fallen power lines that danced and sparked dangerously in the rising water, a deadly electrical hazard that made escape in that direction impossible. The wind had now reached a deafening howl, a primal sound of nature's unleashed fury that seemed to penetrate to the bone. Debris flew through the air with lethal velocity. Broken glass, roof shingles, and branches became projectiles that forced Michael to hunch protectively over the puppy in his arms as he sought another escape route. A piercing crack split the air as the great oak finally surrendered to the wind, toppling with terrible majesty precisely where Michael and Max had been standing moments earlier. The ground shook with the impact, sending tremors through Michael's legs as he realized how close they had come to being crushed beneath its massive weight. The puppy in his arms had begun to whimper, a sound barely audible above the storm, yet somehow cutting straight to Michael's heart. "I've got you, buddy," he whispered, knowing that his next decisions would determine whether either of them would survive the next hour as Hurricane Marcus unleashed its full, devastating potential. With his truck now inaccessible and floodwaters rising rapidly around them, Michael faced the grim reality that evacuation was no longer possible. Their only hope now was to find shelter strong enough to withstand the hurricane's fury and ride out the storm, a prospect that statistics suggested was a desperate gamble with death itself. Clutching Max tightly against his chest, Michael made a split-second decision and fought his way toward the Hendersons' house, knowing it would be locked, but hoping to find a way inside. The structure, while not ideal, was their best chance of survival now that evacuation was impossible. The front door was indeed locked, but Michael remembered the Hendersons kept a spare key, under a decorative rock in their garden. The rising water made finding the hidden key nearly impossible as Michael sloshed through the flooded garden, desperately feeling beneath each decorative stone while keeping Max secured under his jacket. Just as despair began to set in, his fingers touched metal. The key was still there, though nearly submerged by the rapidly rising floodwaters. With trembling, numb fingers, Michael managed to unlock the door, a wave of water following them into the house as they stumbled inside. The Hendersons' home was already showing signs of the storm's assault, windows rattling violently in their frames, and small streams of water seeping in around doorways, despite the family's hasty attempts to seal them before evacuating. Michael knew from his Coast Guard training that even being inside wasn't enough. They needed the strongest part of the house to have any chance of surviving what was coming. "The bathroom," he muttered to the shivering puppy in his arms. "Interior room, smallest windows, plumbing reinforces the walls." It was their best option as the full force of Hurricane Marcus descended upon Port Arthur. The bathroom was in the center of the house, windowless and relatively small. Exactly what they needed. Michael grabbed towels from the linen closet, quickly drying Max's fur as best he could. The puppy's shivering slowly subsided as Michael worked, the animal's terrified eyes never leaving Michael's face, as if understanding that this stranger was now his only hope for survival. Michael's phone buzzed once more, a final text from his sister. "Please tell me you're safe." He managed a quick reply with shaking fingers. "In shelter, can't evacuate. We'll update when possible." He knew the cell networks would fail completely any minute now, leaving them completely cut off from the outside world as the hurricane reached its peak intensity. The house groaned around them, the sound of a structure fighting against forces it was never designed to withstand. A tremendous crash from the living room told Michael that a window had given way, and he quickly closed the bathroom door, placing a towel at its base to block water that might seep in. It was just the two of them now, a man and a puppy, facing the wrath of one of the most powerful forces of nature. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging them into darkness broken only by the faint light of Michael's phone. He quickly turned on its flashlight feature, knowing he needed to conserve battery, but also aware that complete darkness would only add to the terror of their situation, especially for the already traumatized puppy. Max had begun to calm somewhat in the relative security of the bathroom, his small body gradually warming in the cocoon of towels Michael had created. For the first time since Michael had found him tied to the tree, the puppy's tail gave a hesitant wag as he looked up at his rescuer with what seemed like a glimmer of hope in his eyes. That small gesture, that tiny sign of trust amid complete chaos, struck Michael with unexpected force. In that moment, something shifted within him, a crystallization of purpose that transcended mere survival. He wasn't just trying to save a neighbor's pet anymore. He was fighting for this innocent life that now depended entirely on him, a responsibility that filled him with a fierce determination. "We're going to make it, Max," Michael said with newfound conviction, his voice steady despite the deafening symphony of destruction around them. "I promise you, we're going to survive this." And for the first time since hearing that desperate barking, Michael truly believed it. Not just hoped, but believed with an unshakable certainty that surprised even him. The bathroom walls vibrated with the force of the hurricane, and the ceiling creaked ominously above them. Michael positioned himself protectively over Max, creating a human shield against any debris that might come crashing through if the structure began to fail. The puppy snuggled closer, his trembling now more from exhaustion than fear. Michael found himself talking softly to Max, sharing stories of his own dog, Scout, who had seen him through the darkest periods of his life. "He was there when I came back from my service, when I didn't know how to be a civilian again," he confided to the puppy, who watched him with attentive eyes. "Sometimes, I think he understood me better than any human could." As Michael spoke, he realized that his grief over losing Scout had prevented him from considering getting another dog. The pain of that loss had been too raw, too deep. Yet here he was, risking everything for this puppy he barely knew, feeling something awaken inside him that he thought had died along with Scout. The profound connection that can exist between humans and animals. Outside the bathroom, Hurricane Marcus reached its catastrophic peak, with winds exceeding 150 mph tearing through Port Arthur with devastating fury. But inside their small sanctuary, a different force was taking hold. the powerful, healing bond forming between a traumatized puppy and the man who had refused to leave him behind, a connection that would ultimately save them both in ways neither could yet imagine. For hours that felt like eternity, Michael and Max huddled together in the bathroom as Hurricane Marcus unleashed its full fury upon Port Arthur. The sounds were terrifying, the banshee wail of the wind, the crashing of objects against the house, the splintering of wood and shattering of glass. Through it all, Michael kept talking to Max, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. "My dad always said there's no point worrying about things you can't control," Michael told the puppy, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep against his chest, small paws occasionally twitching with doggy dreams despite the apocalyptic conditions around them. "All we can do is our best with what we've got, and right now we've got each other." Sometime in the early morning hours, the storm's intensity began to wane slightly. The terrifying sounds of destruction continued, but Michael could sense a change in the rhythm of the hurricane's assault, a subtle shift that his Coast Guard-trained senses recognized as the beginning of the end, though many dangerous hours still lay ahead. Max awoke and seemed to sense the change too, his ears perking up as he lifted his head from Michael's lap. For the first time, the puppy gave a proper tail wag and even attempted to lick Michael's face, drawing a surprised laugh from the exhausted man. "You're feeling better, huh, buddy? Think we might just make it through this after all." As dawn broke, filtered through the still raging storm, Michael cautiously opened the bathroom door to assess their situation. The interior of the Henderson home had suffered significant damage. Parts of the ceiling had collapsed, windows were shattered, and several inches of water covered the floors. But remarkably, the structure itself was still standing. Michael's phone was nearly dead, but he managed to get a text through to his sister during a brief moment of connectivity. "Still alive, with neighbor's puppy. House damaged, but standing. Will update when possible." That message would eventually lead to a chain of events that would change everything, though neither Michael nor Max could know that yet. By mid-afternoon, Hurricane Marcus had finally moved inland enough that the worst of the wind and rain had passed, though the danger was far from over. Floodwaters continued to rise as runoff from the storm surge worked its way through Port Arthur's overwhelmed drainage systems, turning streets into fast-moving rivers, carrying debris of all kinds. Max needed to go outside, a challenge that required careful navigation through the damaged house and flooded yard. Michael carried the puppy through the dangerous terrain of broken glass and exposed nails, finding a relatively stable spot where Max could relieve himself before quickly returning to their bathroom sanctuary, which remained the safest part of the house. Food became their next concern. The Hendersons' refrigerator was warming without power, but Michael found some dog food in a cabinet and granola bars that would sustain them for a day or two. Water was plentiful, if not clean. Michael used his Coast Guard training to filter rainwater through towels for drinking, sharing it between himself and the increasingly energetic puppy. On the second day after the hurricane's peak, Michael heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors. Search and rescue operations had begun in the devastated areas. Although their immediate vicinity wasn't being searched yet, the sound brought hope that help was getting closer, that their ordeal might soon be coming to an end. That afternoon, Michael's phone miraculously connected to a network long enough to receive a flood of messages. Among them was one that brought tears to his eyes. The Henderson family had been desperately trying to reach anyone who might be able to check on their puppy, having realized their terrible mistake shortly after reaching the evacuation center. Sarah Henderson's message read, "If anyone in Port Arthur can check on our puppy Max, he's in our backyard. We thought he was in the car. Our children are devastated. Please, if anyone can help." The timestamp showed it had been sent just hours after they had evacuated, but too late for anyone to safely respond before the hurricane hit. Michael's hands shook as he typed a reply with his phone's remaining battery. "I have Max. We sheltered in your bathroom. He's safe. House damaged, but we're okay." The message sent just before his phone died completely, leaving him to wonder if it had actually reached them as he and Max settled in for another night, the puppy now curled trustingly against his side. What Michael couldn't know was that his message had indeed reached the Hendersons, triggering a wave of emotions, relief, gratitude, and disbelief that someone had risked their life to save their puppy. Sarah Henderson's tearful sharing of the message with emergency management officials had prioritized their address for rescue operations the following day. Dawn of the third day brought the welcome sound of airboats navigating the flooded streets of their neighborhood. When rescuers finally reached the Henderson home, they found an exhausted but smiling Michael sitting on what remained of the front porch, a now energetic yellow Labrador puppy bouncing excitedly at his side, both survivors of an ordeal that would soon capture hearts across the nation. The reunion at the evacuation center was a moment of pure emotional catharsis. 8-year-old Emma and 5-year-old Jake Henderson burst into tears at the sight of their beloved Max, who recognized them instantly and squirmed with excitement in Michael's arms. Sarah and David Henderson embraced Michael with the desperate gratitude of parents whose children had been saved from heartbreak. "I don't know how to thank you," David said, his voice breaking as he shook Michael's hand repeatedly. When we got to the evacuation center and Max wasn't there, it was the worst moment of our lives." Sarah couldn't speak at all, simply holding onto Michael's arm as tears streamed down her face while watching her children hugging their miraculously rescued puppy. The story might have ended there, a private act of courage and kindness between neighbors, but a local news crew covering the hurricane's aftermath happened to capture the reunion on camera. By that evening, the footage of an exhausted Michael arriving at the shelter with an energetic Max had gone viral, touching hearts across a nation in need of an uplifting story amid the destruction. When interviewed, Michael downplayed his actions with characteristic humility. "I just couldn't leave him there," he said simply, as Max playfully nipped at his fingers on camera. Anyone would have done the same thing. But viewers across America knew differently. Not everyone would have risked everything for a neighbor's puppy, and Michael's quiet courage struck a powerful chord. In the weeks that followed, as Port Arthur began the long process of rebuilding, Michael found himself the recipient of unexpected generosity. A GoFundMe set up by the Hendersons to help replace his truck, which had been destroyed in the hurricane, quickly exceeded its goal tenfold. Letters and gifts arrived from across the country, many from people sharing stories of their own beloved pets. Perhaps more significantly, Michael found himself reconnecting with parts of himself that had been dormant since losing Scout. The Hendersons insisted he visit Max regularly, and those visits became a highlight of Michael's week. As he watched the puppy grow and thrive, their bond undiminished by their return to normal life. There was a healing in this that no therapist had been able to provide in the months following Scout's passing. 6 months after Hurricane Marcus, Michael made a decision that would complete his own journey of recovery. With encouragement from the Hendersons, he adopted a rescue dog of his own, a 3-year-old German Shepherd mix named Stella, who had been abandoned during the hurricane. In Stella's wary eyes, Michael recognized a kindred spirit who had survived trauma and needed someone who understood. The media picked up this follow-up story as well, and Michael reluctantly agreed to one final interview, Max and Stella both by his side. When asked what lesson people should take from his experience, Michael thought carefully before answering. "I guess I'd say that sometimes the things that seem most irrational, like risking everything for a puppy, turn out to be the most human choices we can make." What began as a split-second decision in a moment of crisis had rippled outward, touching countless lives through its simple message. That compassion for the vulnerable, even at great personal risk, represents humanity at its finest. Max, now a healthy, growing Labrador with no signs of his traumatic beginnings, had become a symbol of resilience and hope for an entire community rebuilding after disaster. As for Michael, he found an unexpected peace in his new normal, teaching high school physics by day, volunteering with local animal rescue organizations in his spare time, and coming home to Stella's enthusiastic greeting each evening. Sometimes on weekends, he and Stella would visit the Hendersons, where Max would bound out to meet them with unbridled joy. The connection between man and dog, an enduring reminder that the most powerful storms, both literal and emotional, can be survived when we refuse to abandon those who need us most.